Welcome, friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate. It's so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those tragedies and challenges you faced or are facing right now, do not define you. They refine you. They did not happen to you. They happened for you. And no one I know knows that better than the host of the show, the founder of Beyond the Crucible, and my friend, Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, we've got a great guest who you actually heard first and wanted to bring her on the show because you were so impressed and moved by what she had to say. And I think our listeners will be today as well.
There's no question. Very much looking forward to this conversation with Beth.
Well, thanks for having me today, guys.
And that Beth that Warwick spoke about and who you heard speaking to you is Beth Guckenberger. Beth and her husband, Todd, live with their family in Cincinnati, Ohio, where they serve as co-executive directors of Back2Back Ministries. After graduating from Indiana University, the Guckenbergers moved to Monterrey, Mexico, where they lived for 15 years. Between biological foster and adoptive children, they have raised 11 children. Beth is tired. Beth is also the author of 11 books. That'll make you tired too, including adult and children's titles. She travels and speaks regularly at conferences, youth gatherings, and church services about reckless faith. Her style is based in storytelling, and she draws from her vast field experience as a missionary, Bible teacher, and parent for illustrations of biblical concepts. Warwick, this is going to be a good one, so I'm going to shut up and let you go with your questions.
Well, Beth, I'm so excited to have you here. I first met you and your husband, Todd, at a Taylor event. Just, I don't know, back in February, and you spoke a few times, and I was just blown away by your story. And in particular, you talked about reckless faith. I mean, I just could not get that word out of my mind because I've done some pretty bold things, I suppose, including a somewhat stupid $2.25 billion takeover of my family's media company, which I guess that was bold, but it wasn't the smartest move, which listeners are pretty well aware of. But that concept of reckless faith, I mean, you talk in your book about a burr in your saddle. You've written a lot of books. And this is the first one, but I had to read that book. There was something about it that's like, what does that mean? Because that does not feel like me, but I need to understand it. So it was almost haunting. I know you don't like people saying your books haunted them, but in the best sense of the word, haunting. All that's to say, it's a privilege to have you here. And I kind of just wanted to start a bit, Beth, with a bit of the backstory, the origin story of kind of where you grew up, your parents, and maybe even, obviously, a very missional person, having spent 15 years in Mexico with orphan ministry and now Back2Back Ministries. But as you're telling your story of growing up, I wonder if there's any threads that, looking back now, you can see how you ended up where you did. But just tell us a bit about a young Beth and growing up and your family and all.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, both of you, on this conversation. I always like to imagine that a listener is sitting at the table with us. And when I think about telling my family story, it was very idyllic for most of my childhood. My parents loved each other. They loved God. They loved my siblings and I. We had only safe adults around us. So I certainly, grew to understand that there were dark forces in the world. There were people doing bad things, but I never interacted really with any of them. And so while that made for healthy self-esteem and it made for healthy understanding of connection and attachment and communication, it also, one of the unintended consequences of that kind of idyllic childhood is that I formed a theology around this idea that if you do your thing, if you do right by God, he'll do right by you, because that's certainly what I had seen. And so, I had been encouraged by my parents, and I had watched God do some big things, even as a teenager, then through college. We started a young life ministry when I was a freshman in high school. And I remember club leaders saying, if we get 50 people in your parents' basement, that would be killer. And I immediately thought to myself, we need to get 100 people in that basement. And we had well more than 100 that first day. And just that spirit of asking God for big things, bold things. I would later use phrases like assignments that outsized me, wanting to stretch bigger than anyone thought was possible, and then giving God credit for it. So I had those muscles pretty well exercised all through college, lots of mission trip experiences, lots of thinking, man, I have God on my side. Nothing is impossible. And so it was just a little speed bump when the year I got married, I was 22 and my dad was 51. He was diagnosed with cancer. And I told him, hey, no worries. Like, we know God. It doesn't matter what the cancer counts say. It doesn't matter what a doctor says. Like, it's going to be okay. Like, God, he lets water get pulled on an altar and still lights it up on fire. There's still, like, anything is possible. And even before I should have, I was standing in front of churches telling people, don't be crying about my dad. God's going to do something really amazing in the end. And the last weeks of his life, he could see that the crash was coming because he knew he was dying, and he knew I was not facing that. And he knew that once reality hit me, it was going to be bad. And it was. I remember the moment my father passed, my brothers and mother and I were in the room, and all of a sudden you could tell when he was gone. And I looked at my brothers and I'm like, Dad just moved. Like, heaven's not a theory. It's actually like an address. And he moved there. And I had assumed I wanted my GPS set to where my parents' GPS had been set to, because that looked like a pretty good life. But all of a sudden, the GPS got moved. And I thought, how do I live a life that's based on things that are still to come and not on the things that are in the here and now? But it was conflicting with this deep disappointment that God had failed me. And I broke up with him for a while. I walked away from my faith for a season. It wasn't comfortable for me because it's really all I had ever known, but it was this, like, can bad things happen and God still be good? A pretty primary question to ask. But it just took my breath away. And so when God and I got back together again, I had to accept that he was sovereign. And if he was doing something, regardless if I didn't like it or worse, didn't understand it, I could trust it. And later I would find a verse in the book of Jeremiah that says, when you extract the precious from the worthless, then you can be my spokesman. That's in the 15th chapter of the book of Jeremiah. I didn't know that verse, but that's what I was busy doing there in the aftermath, trying to figure out, in the midst of something that felt worthless to me, death feels worthless, like that should not have happened. How can I find precious in the midst of it? And it really set me up for then what would become a lifetime of working in some of the hardest and darkest stories around our globe. I had my eyes now peeled for precious.
You know, what's interesting, Beth, is on this podcast, and I don't know, we've had over like 150 episodes or so, we hear a lot of really tough origin stories. I mean, the stuff you experience on a daily basis with, with the orphanage, that's not uncommon. Victims of abuse, abandonment, physical challenges, quadriplegics, paraplegics, financial failures, drug addiction. I mean, we've had pretty much them all. But your origin story is unusual because, it was a good, loving family. And yet I haven't thought of this before, but sometimes there can be challenges when you grow up with a seemingly perfect, almost Disneyland kind of experience. I mean, how could that be challenging? Every child wants that. Probably every orphan you've ever ministered to has said, boy, I wish I could have grown up the way you did, Beth. That just sounds a life I can't even imagine. I can't even contemplate. But I mean, does that make sense? Talk about how,
yes.
I think you've really explained it. Even growing up in the so-called perfect family with loving, wonderful, God-loving parents, that can set you, well, I don't say not for failure, but that can have its own unintended consequences. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Just no one's immune, and I would love to have God have taught me the lessons that I learned in that season in 100 other ways. But I certainly had to metabolize at the most basic level. Do I trust God? And do I really believe this life is about that one? Because if I do, then I believe that God created my dad for eternity, and his plan was not thwarted when he only had 50, a little over 50 of those years here on earth. He was still created for eternity and will live for eternity. Am I going to really believe that I'm living for a world that's to come? And w- when I work, I work. I don't know if we've mentioned it yet, but I work with orphaned and vulnerable children around the world, and they have some really hard stories. And some of those stories, those knots are not going to get untied here on earth. Like the consequences of the choices that other people have made and that they have to face, that they'll carry with them forever here on earth. There are some miracle stories. There are ways in which you can't believe it, how stories get turned around. But for a lot of kids, they have to live with the consequences of choices parents made before they even got to raise their hand and say, this isn't fair. And if I believed, I think so. I've been doing that work 26 years now. I think if you were to poll some of the communities where I serve, I think what they'd say that I bring to the table is a sense of hope. Like, and hope is it's a powerful gift to bring into a conversation. A hope that things can still be good even when they're hard. A hope that your questions can remain unanswered and you can still find peace. A hope that there are good days still ahead, even in the midst of something that feels devastating. Like there's a lot of messages of hope out there. And I think that probably walking through my dad's death and the aftermath of that impact on my family, his parting gift to me was God is sovereign and you can have hope. And I will forever carry those inside of me into all the kind of complications that life threw in the aftermath of that, the adult-sized problems that I had not yet experienced.
I mean, maybe one of the other gifts maybe he gave your upbringing, even before all that, you always had hope. We're not going to have 50 people for Young Life. We're going to have 100, 150. You have, I guess, a sense of hope ingrained, whether it's God-given or parents or family. It sounds like that is something that you came out of the box or through your parents, through God. That makes sense. That sense of optimism, there's probably a few dents along the way, but sure seems like you came out of the box that way, right?
Yeah, I do think it's part of its temperament, whether you use the Enneagram or your Myers-Briggs or whatever your personality profile is. I always tend to skew that way. So some of that is just part of how I was made to be. And part of it is having seen marriages that look like there was no hope for them getting resurrected, watching prodigals come home, watching, sicknesses get reversed. Like I keep saying, we all have little banks of testimonies, and some of those testimonies in our banks are stories other people tell us about the things that have happened in their life. This is why we have podcasts like this, so people can put someone else's story in their bank of testimonies. And some of the stories in our bank of testimonies come from our own life, things I witnessed that have happened. And when we're in maybe one of those crucible moments, we're in one of those moments where like, man, I do not know which way this is going to go. Then we withdraw from that bank of testimonies and we can pull from it hope, perspective, encouragement, discernment, wisdom, whatever we need from the things that we have accrued. And so like when I think about particularly my childhood and kind of early adult life, the way it set me up for some of the challenges we would have in international orphan care ministry and community development around the world is like, kind of make me like, you tell me it's not possible. Like all things are possible. Like really anything can happen. And when most people tell me something can't work, it feels frankly like a dare to me. And In fact, someone asked me the other day so Reckless Faith came out almost 15 years ago, and they were asking
Wow.
me, so do you think the older you get, the less reckless that you are because the stakes are higher
Huh.
and you realize,
Uh-huh.
and I said, no, actually, it's quite the opposite. The older I get, the more reckless I become because I now have more deposits in my bank of testimonies. And I now can tell you with even more certainty that I'll be just fine. And even more than I ever imagined is possible. And so, reckless faith is it's a relevant message for me still today.
Well, that's mind blowing. I want to, before we hit the bounce back, I guess you've mentioned it a couple of times. You very kindly sent it to me, so I'll hold up for people. This is the original one, Reckless Faith. That is mind blowing. I love the subtitle, Let Go and Be Led. I mean, that is just, that says it all. But so before we kind of talk a bit about how you bounce back through this, one of the talks you gave at the Taylor event, I think you mentioned there was another challenge. I know you've adopted some kids. It was an adoption challenge that was not easy. And you used the word spiritual bruises. I think you used that phrase, and a bit like reckless faith. It's like, gosh, I think I know what that word means. What an incredible phrase, spiritual bruises. Again, it was just swimming around in my brain, that phrase. And I think you talked about, I believe, just the experience with your dad left you, I don't know, more prone to be triggered by different things. So I don't know if that makes sense at all. I remember something like that. Talk about what you meant by that part of the talk, and maybe there was another crucible, if you will.
A year or two after my dad was gone, my husband and I tried to adopt a set of sisters that were 1 and 3 at one of the orphanages that we served. And we felt like God told us to do it. And we started that arduous process of an international adoption and the paperwork it requires. And then halfway through that process, it got disrupted. And maybe if I had been in a healthier place, it would have just felt like something along the lines of, this just wasn't meant to be. But instead, because I was tender, I was mad. Like, here I am again, feeling like, I thought you were powerful. You're obviously not that powerful, or this thing would have happened. Like, why didn't you stop what stopped it? I now know, because of the work we do in trauma training in our organization, that anger in all of its forms is a secondary emotion sitting on the primary emotion of fear. I was actually scared. I just didn't have the words to say that. So it came out like anger. Then I got pregnant with my first child. And in the process of that pregnancy, delivered her in Mexico, where we were living at the time. And pretty fast, after about 6 weeks after her birth, I got a call about a little boy who was her exact same age and who had been moved from one Mexican state into another. And his international adoption eligibility was shrinking. And someone was just looking for an American family who was paperwork ready, who would execute an adoption that very week. And I was paperwork ready because I'd gotten ready for those 2 sisters the year before. And we kind of sprung into action and felt like God was opening this crazy door for us. And is this what he always meant to have happen? And we brought my son home that week. And he and my daughter are the same age. And it was really exciting for like a hot second until I realized that he had some kind of disability. I didn't have any expertise in disability, so I didn't know what it was. It turns out he was diagnosed eventually with severe cerebral palsy, and the physician was able to let us know he'll never walk or talk or live independently. And while we at that point already were pretty crazy about him, we loved him like a son. It was another pressing in on that spiritual bruise. Like, gosh, I don't even know what to do at this point. Like, I'm definitely not going to pray for healing because that did not work. And I'm supposed to trust you, God, but is this really what you had in mind? Because now this young boy needs a lot of medical attention that would require us to live in the United States. And I thought that you wanted us to live as missionaries in another country. So which one is it? Like, are you asking me to do that or this? And could you just make up your mind? And again, a lot of anger coming up, but it was not really anger. It was actually just fear. I just didn't know how to say it. Then the way God healed my spiritual bruise, 18 months later, my son still had met none of his developmental milestones. One afternoon, just started to move across the floor. And I mean, I didn't even know what I was looking at. I left the room for just a minute to get a camera to video him. And when I came back in the room, he was all the way across the floor, and he pulled himself up on a couch and turned around and walked across the room into my arms. And I realized I was looking at a miracle, but I'd never seen a miracle before. I never even knew anybody who had seen a miracle, but I couldn't deny what I was looking at. And, eventually that young boy, my son never again had any other signs of cerebral palsy. He was considered medically healed, went on to become a pretty tremendous athlete, played football for the university where our children attended. And I got to share his story with his university campus. And at one point, when I was telling the story and I got to the part of his healing, the students started to cheer because that's what kids do. And I told them, listen, I'm not sharing this. And the same thing is true for your listeners. I'm not sharing this so that people know wildly personal things about my family. I'm just here to testify that what God taught me is that with him, still all things are possible. Because I'm the same girl that prayed to the same God for two people that I loved. And one of those stories did not turn out the way I wanted it. And one of them turned out better than I even asked it for. And the way that God healed my spiritual bruise is he basically whispered to my very soul, just trust me. Like, no matter what happens, I am good and I am to be trusted. And man, that lesson I have carried with me. My son's 25. I've carried with me the last 25 years because there were lots of stories when I would find myself subsequently were lots of crucible moments, disappointments. I thought I heard you. Did you want this or that? Just let me know. This is not turning out the way I thought it was. I don't like this circumstance. I can't control this circumstance. And the reminder of that God is good and he can be trusted has carried me through a lot of hard seasons.
I mean, there's so much in what you just said. That is remarkable stories you share in your book, your daughter Emma and your son Evan. And you mentioned looking back that whole artificial twinning that your daughter is, significantly responsible being used by God for your son walking. And I don't know if kids tease each other about that, saying, hey.
Very much so, all the time.
Just remember, it's all me.
Every touchdown, she said, those are my 7 points, by the way.
Yes, I'm sure it's all said in good nature and fun. And,
yes.
But that's just remarkable. And, I think what you said is sort of deposits in the bank is that, sometimes things will work out the way we hope they would. And, God is sovereign in the way we hope it'd be. Sometimes he's sovereign in ways that is hard to understand, but those drops of grace that, manna from heaven, as sort of the Israelites had, sort of that sort of sweet bread that came from heaven, to get them through the desert as they were fleeing Egypt. Those do get you through. You remember God, when God really showed up, and there are other times you can't understand, but he's sovereign. So those are the drops of grace that help us to go through and carry on and trust and believe. He doesn't have to, but he does, which is remarkable. So I want to talk a bit about your ministry with Back2Back Ministries, and it kind of, at least reading the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like it all started in Albania. You'd say, well, no, it all started in Mexico, didn't it? Well, yes and no, right? And you were there with Crew in '94 with Todd, and you saw this child on the street. So talk about how there was something about that event that, I don't know, you talk about defining moments. Maybe that was a defining moment that altered the course of your life. So talk about that story. And I think later you talk about, I believe it's about this, I was going to say burr under the saddle. That's probably a different story.
Well, it's all connected. I mean, it's okay. It's not a book report. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll get to that other story in a second, but talk about the Albanian kid, and thank you. I'm glad it's not a book report, even though I've got lots of notes, but still.
I was going to say,
talk about that Albanian
you would
kid.
still pass. Yeah. When you look at your life, in any point in hindsight, you realize how there were these inciting incidents that happen that set you on a course that you don't know at the time. Hey, my whole life is changing. You just are living the life that you're living. But you can look back and realize that's why that happened. And I think we were college students at Indiana University, and Albania had been under a pretty difficult government for about 2 generations, and they were essentially couped. And we knew that they had about a month and a half where they would be reorganizing and probably shut out the Western world again, and therefore all evangelical influences. And so they were asking college students if anybody could afford to take an additional week out of classes and would go for 2 weeks to Albania. They were just trying to blitz the country to expose as many as people as possible to the gospel. And so as you know, I like to say yes. So I'm like, yes, sign me up. So we went. He was my current husband, but at the time he was just my boyfriend. And we were going around to university campuses and government buildings and local parks and telling people about Jesus. And then I think now, looking back, there probably was a miscommunication, and there was an afternoon free, and they were trying to figure out something to do with us, and they took us to an orphanage. And it gave me a sensitivity. It was the first orphanage I'd ever been to the idea that somebody, I had watched Little Orphan Annie. Like, I knew the concept of an orphan, but I'd never actually met an orphan. And it was hard for me to imagine institutionalized orphans, like kids who are living in homes. And then the very next day, we were walking down the main highway in Tirana, the capital of Albania. And I saw a toddler that was asleep on the sidewalk without a single adult in sight. And I kind of rushed over to that child with my newfound glasses that were seeing vulnerable kids in new ways since the day before. And the translator hurried over to tell me to not touch the child. And I said, well, he's out here all by himself. Like, somebody needs to hold him. And he told me it was a gypsy child, that the gypsies were keeping kids awake all night long so they would sleep during the day. And he said, if you lift up his side, you'll see people have been throwing money at him all day. They'll come around at dusk, wake up the children, collect the money, and stay up all night. And I literally grew up on a street that was called Sunday Lane. It was as picturesque and idyllic as you can possibly imagine for a street called Sunday Lane. And I just didn't have any worldview that somebody would treat a child like that. And I understood and respected that they didn't want me to touch the child, but I wasn't quite ready to leave him. So I sat on the bench for a little bit with Todd and with this translator, and just kept wondering out loud, like, are there more kids like him? And does he know that this is being done? And if somebody picked him up, is the parent miles away? And does anybody care? And just kind of the hardest versions of those questions you could ask. I was just kind of outward processing. And on the way home on the airplane, people were all buzzing on our plane about some of the crazy experiences we'd had in a country so far from the state we were living in the United States, and with a people group, a country that was in utter chaos, trying to reorganize itself, and just remarkable stories we had seen. And honestly, all I could think about was that gypsy kid and that orphanage I'd been in, and what did it mean? How many more kids out there were like that? And what did that mean for us for the rest of our life? And, when I think about the story of the life I live today, it very much started on that park bench when I just felt kind of gobsmacked with the reality that kids are treated that way.
I feel like in God's providence, that was one moment he dropped in your life. And then I feel like a little bit after, there was another moment he dropped, which was the story I was getting the two together, in which you were visiting Mexico. I don't think you'd moved there permanently yet. It was a missions trip. And you were in an orphanage, and you were providing toys and hamburgers to the kids. But yet one little girl did something unexpected with that hamburger. So talk about what she did and why it affected you so much, and why that was a defining moment, that little girl in that orphanage on that missions trip in Mexico.
Yeah, we were participating in a mission trip that someone else had organized. And we were painting a wall around the church from blue to green, which is kind of okay, except for the year before we'd been there and painted it from green to blue. And people were just trying to keep us busy. I don't think we weren't swept up in anybody's strategic plan or mission.
Okay.
And in the back of my mind, I'd never left that gypsy child and what it had stirred in me. And so just pretty miserable on this experience and wanting kids to have a different kind of experience than the one we were having. I said to Todd, do you think there's any orphans in this city? And he didn't have any idea, but man, it was worth exploring. So we eventually found an orphanage, and the director of that children's home told us that the kids hadn't had meat in over a year. And so the next day we brought enough meat that we thought would feed those 50 kids for a month. And I was serving the hamburgers off of a griddle right into kids' plates and hands. And this little girl came up for the 5th time. And Todd was like, hey, listen, I don't know a single preschooler who can eat 5 hamburgers. So something's going on with the food. Why don't you follow her and see if you can find out what's going on? So I followed her like up some stairs and down a hall and into the door frame of what was her dorm room. And I stopped because from that vantage point, I could see the other preschoolers. They were all waiting, helping each other lift up mattresses, and they were sticking those burgers underneath them, saving them for another day because they'd never tasted or seen anything like that, really, probably in their memories. And I just kept thinking, gosh, I know people who would buy hamburgers for orphans if they just knew how to get them here. And, the vision of the life that I live was born in that moment, like the idea that we could build a bridge. I didn't realize at the time that things would flow in both directions over that bridge. I didn't understand. I had a lot to learn about poverty. I had a lot to learn about, nonprofit work. I had a lot to learn about the language and the culture. And there was still a lot of lessons ahead for me. But in that moment, I thought, I think that God's kids are supposed to do something about this. And I mean, it might as well be me. And on the way home, we talked about what would it look like for us to try to do that. And I got back, mission trips are usually a week. I went home and drove my same car, my same job, same condo, same friends, same life. But I kept saying, I feel like I got a burr in my saddle. Like I'm trying to sit down in the same place. I just feel something poking at me. And eventually that burr caused us to just want to do something now, even though we weren't really in a position to. So we decided we were double income, no kids. We were going to just live off of one of our teaching salaries and save the other one. And at the end of that year, sitting on what we thought would be a pot of gold, we were going to ask God what he would have us do. Will we buy a bunch of hamburgers with that gold? Will we buy a plane ticket with that gold? What would he want us to do? And it turns out he wanted us to go. And so that 1 year of a teaching salary basically supported us for a year of living in Mexico. And that's the start of the organization that we still lead today.
One of the things that you said to me when we talked earlier, Beth, was that you started Back2Back Ministries, right? It was birthed out of your checkbook.
Yeah.
And fast forward, now you told me it's probably, and it could be more now, 400 employees. So from a line item in your checkbook to 400 employees, that is, as they say, money well spent, right? I mean, you have to look back on that and go, that leap that you took was the right leap to take, and it's made, in all humility, it's made quite an impact.
Yeah, it is. It's again where you look back and you realize, when you say yes to anything, yes, I'll go, yes, I'll give, yes, I'll do, yes, I'll say, whatever, you really only see the step that you're about to take. You don't have any idea where that step will lead you, what relationship it'll put you into, what door it will open. You just don't know. And if we spend too much time evaluating what's going to happen after our yeses and nos, we might get kind of stunned to inactivity. And I found that I recognize a closed door pretty fast. So I tend to say yes first. And if the door's shut, okay, it's shut. But if it's not shut, who the heck knows what's on the other side? And that's part of the adventure of life, really.
Beth, that leads to, there's a lot of fascinating things in this book, but you talk in a number of places about a refined faith versus a reckless faith. And boy, I'm one of these people that, yes, I've made my leaps of faith. I'm one of these people that, I don't know, I like to think I'm as fearful as the next person and very cautious, think, plan, and go think again before taking a baby step. But the only thing that's gotten me out of it, if I feel like the Lord's telling me to do something, I will tend to do it come what may, because I've got a fair amount of perseverance. So I guess God gave me that to balance out my innate caution and fear, which is another story. But so I tend to be, by nature, a bit in the refined faith category. So talk a bit about the difference, because I'd never heard it described that way. And it's like, again, that was, haunted me a bit in the best sense of that word.
Yeah.
So, this is not a thing that most listeners will be familiar with, reckless versus refined. But tell the listeners what the difference is.
Yeah. I have a more sophisticated answer in the book, but basically I say, if you know what you're going to be doing 50 Sundays from now, your faith is not reckless enough. There has to be some element of, I'm not in control and I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know where this is going to lead. And I think all of our faith fits in a frame, like what our understanding of God, what he can and cannot do, what he means in our lives, all of our theology, our orthodoxy and orthopraxy and all of that, it fits in a frame. And if we're not willing for that frame to stretch and grow and break and get reframed, then we have a pretty refined faith. And honestly, it'll get you to heaven, right? We know what our Bible says about that kind of thing. But what kind of life do we miss out on when we don't allow God to reintroduce himself to us?
I'll just read just a couple of things you say about reckless faith, just for the listeners. A truly reckless faith, however, always expects change, and as a result is eager to risk more and fear less. A reckless faith knows there is more to the story, more we can't see, more than I experience. It is hungry. Then later on, you talk about, there's a lot of incidents that for people familiar with the Bible will be familiar with. It refers to the woman, Mary, who used an expensive bottle of perfume to wash Jesus' feet with her hair. So you use that image and a bunch of others. You say a reckless faith understands the best use of an expensive bottle of perfume may be to wash somebody's feet. A reckless faith charges into the sea before thinking that God may part the water. A reckless faith leaves 99 sheep to go after the one. It does not need man's approval or man's money. A reckless faith believes in death to us part. It's, that's sort of just that sense of, I think C.S. Lewis talks about that still small voice of God when you know that you know it's him, are just willing to step out in faith, even when you don't have all the answers and all the plans. And that feels like what you're talking about. Is that like a reasonable summary?
Yes, of course it is. And it just, we live in a world so full of Yelp reviews, right? Amazon reviews. We need everyone else to tell us, this is a good idea. This is a really good idea. You should definitely buy this. And here's exactly what my experience was. And you can make your choices based on what my choices were like. And I don't want to look left or right. I don't want to make my choices based on what's happening around me. I want to have a singular vision of what's before me and attack it. I'm currently in the middle of a project. It's with very high stakes and a huge possibility for failure. In fact, we hired a consultant the other day, and they said to me, what kind of odds are you putting on this thing happening? And I said, that actually it's not the point. Even if what I'm hoping happened doesn't end up happening, there's something in this journey that I'll take with me the rest of my life. And I'm not I'm not reckless. I'm not foolish. There's a difference in my mind between reckless and foolish. I'm not foolish, but I will not be held down by the opinion of others. And I think that's what I was trying to summarize in that paragraph you just read.
I want to jump in and just for the listeners, pull some things together, because both of you, again, this is my favorite part of the show, Beth, when what the guest says, the guest's story and Warwick's story kind of align. And I found this article that you wrote on your blog from 2021, New Chapters in Your Life and How to Embrace Them. And you list 5 steps to go through there. And 2 of those steps are things that if you go to beyondthecrucible.com right now, you'll find the same things written there, right? Mm-hmm. What you've just described about not having to have all the answers, just take one step. That's what you say in this article. One of the steps is to take one step. Warwick talks about it all the time here on the show. Guests here on the show talk about it all the time. Take that first small step. Trust that step. One foot in front of the other. That's what you did. That's what you're doing. That's what you're doing right now as you're facing that situation that you talked about where the consultant's like, so what kind of odds are you giving this, right? And you're not even probably thinking about that, right? You're thinking about, I'm taking this step because this is where I'm supposed to go. And that I think is the great equalizer in what we have here with the show, what Warwick's created and the guests that we bring on is regardless of background, regardless of crucible, regardless of story of coming back from that crucible, folks learned something from the crucible. They've applied that to their life moving forward. And that is how they're living their life, one step at a time. So I just had to bring that up for folks who are listening in to say, nope, you're not crazy. That's the same thing that you've heard 147 other times on this show as we've gone through it.
Yeah.
No, well said.
Someone just asked me, an interviewer was asking me about a new book I wrote recently and said, tell me the distinctive, tell me what makes this message unique. And I said, I actually don't want it to be distinctive and I don't want it to be unique. If I'm the only person that's hearing that message, that means I heard it wrong. If right. I get encouragement and comfort when I realize God's told the same thing to other people. And so I love the fact that something that I felt compelled to write about is something that you all have found to be true, and may that just strengthen us each.
Mm-hmm. As I want to talk a little bit more about Back2Back Ministries, but one of the things you just talked about with this big initiative you're doing, another thought I think you're implicitly saying, the journey is as, if not more important than the destination. If you feel called to do it, you don't necessarily know if it's going to work or not, but you feel certain that the journey will be worth it. Yes. Irrespective of the result. That is counterintuitive for most people. It's like, it's all about the result. Well, no. It's like the adage, does God care about what we're going to accomplish for him? Again, very brief segue, but in my naivety growing up in this 150-year-old, very large family media business that was started by as strong a business person for Christ as I've ever come across, and then faith waned a bit as the power and money grew, I felt like, well, I know God's plan. I'm a believer, and Oxford Harvard Business School became a believer at Oxford, and Evangelical Anglican Church. I know God's plan. It's to resurrect the company in the image of the founder. It's pretty obvious to me. That'd be a good plan for God, wouldn't it be? That must be God's plan. Clearly, despite my mistakes, if he wanted it to happen, God's sovereign, it would have. It didn't happen. The $2.25 billion takeover failed spectacularly after 3 years. So it's like, okay, so does God really care about the size of what I could do for him? Or does he care more about me and my heart? And, I've done some things since that maybe not quite on that epic a scale, but I don't think God really cares about the size of what we do. He cares about our heart. Like you've done a massive amount for orphans, but is there more? Of course there is. It's a drop in the bucket in one sense, which could be depressing. Are there other organizations that do more? I don't know, maybe, but it's kind of irrelevant, right? It's like you can get caught up in the size of it and, gosh, I did something big for God last year, or now it's going to be small, and you get caught up in numbers and impact rather than, it's kind of irrelevant. Does that line of thinking make sense at all?
It does. And I just had a large speaking opportunity, and I was kind of excited about, the size of the venue and the attention it would bring to what we were doing. And I had a very meaningful experience with the person that picked me up from the airport, and that was supposed to be my host for that day. And at the end of the night, when I went to bed, I thought, my gosh, this whole thing was actually about that conversation. Like God just that was his plan A for the day. The rest of this was just gravy. And I hope God did something with that event. But I actually think the whole reason I went to that city was to have that conversation with that person. And I think there's something to training our eyes to not be impressed with style all the time and to be more on the lookout for substance. And he can do substance in the middle of successes and in the middle of failures.
Amen. I want to talk about, just as we're sort of rounding out the conversation, Back2Back Ministries. You lived in Mexico for 15 years now, in Cincinnati. One of the statistics in the book that may not be surprising, but for those who are not that familiar with the world of orphan ministries, maybe, and this statistic is out of date, but sadly, it's probably still true. You mentioned, I think you mentioned, 15 years ago, there were 143.5 million orphans in the world. I'm guessing it's probably larger than that, probably by a lot. But then what you said here is, it's hard to read, to be honest, but it says, statistics say that 90% of orphans go into the black market or prostitution. They often lack family support. And you give lots of stories in this book, and I'm sure others. It's a pretty dark, depressing world. Mm-hmm. And you save some, you can't save all of them, be it spiritually, physically, and that's got to be soul crushing. But talk about just, this isn't for the faint of heart, but talk about this ministry, and it'd be easy to get depressed and say, I saved one, but there are 30 abused kids who I didn't save. I saw them for a second and they left. And I did everything I could, but how do you work in that area without it crushing your soul? Yeah, there's some glimmers of hope, but the darkness must feel overwhelming. How do you work in that kind of environment?
Yeah, tenderly. There's a pastor in the United States named Andy Stanley, and he has a phrase. He says, do for one what you wish you could do for them all. There is a sense that you have to just realize, I'm going to do for one. And I hope that in my doing for one, I inspire, encourage, or challenge someone else to do something for their one. And there's enough people in God's family to turn around those numbers if everybody does their something for their one. I happen to make this my vocation, so I'm helping more than one. But if we would all have eyes to see, there's a Greek word that sometimes is translated in our Bibles as look, like Peter looked at someone, John looked at someone. But a better translation is like double taked or looked. And I'm always challenging myself, make sure you look, like make sure you double take. Don't let your eye linger there, even though it might make you sad, or it might make you feel helpless, or it might make you angry, or you might feel afraid. Don't be afraid to look, because it's when we look that God gives us his heart and sight for things. And so, to some of the listeners on your podcast who have experienced really, really worse days, they know what it feels like to have nobody look at them, right? Sometimes our pain is so bad that people just avoid us because I don't know. I don't even know what I would do with that kind of thing. That is so hard. But we remember who look at us. We remember who came for us in those moments. And that's exactly what it feels like to a child in their darkest day when someone comes for them.
And somebody cares. One of the things you have on your website is this 5-point child development plan. And again, I'm not an expert in orphan care. You know way more than I do. But I looked at that and I was blown away. It is so different. It's just this holistic. You talk about the sustainability of the orphan, the spiritual, physical, educational, emotional, social. That just feels a lot different than meeting the physical needs, which is obviously important. To talk about why all those points are important to care for orphans and ultimately give them hope and a sustainable future. Talk about those 5 points, because it just blew my mind reading them. It just seemed so wise.
Well, in the beginning, we weren't that wise. In the very beginning, we just met physical needs because that's all we could see. And then our language skills caught up with us, and we wanted to make sure people knew we were doing it in the name of Jesus, not in our own name. And then Our tagline was, we provide care for today and hope for tomorrow, but it didn't feel like much hope for tomorrow when kids were leaving orphanages across the world around age 15, when the government stops giving it to them for free. They were chronologically 15, emotionally, because of their trauma, more like 10, 11, and 12, not able to take care of themselves out in the world, finding each other, making babies they couldn't take care of, and bringing them right back to the same places. So then we thought education is the key. That's it. We're going to just make sure everybody gets a fabulous education, and this will set them up for life. And so we got a lot of attention when we did that. We were taking orphans all the way through bachelor's degrees in countries where not many people had that level of education. And I was meeting country presidents, and it was very exciting. And then we graduated one of our first college graduates, a computer systems engineer. And after 6 weeks in his new job, he told us he was going to quit because there was this guy who was following him around everywhere, and he was driving him crazy because he was always telling him what to do. And I said, "Is he your boss?" Yeah, he's our boss. And I realized that this young man had all the intellectual capabilities of performing his responsibilities, but he had so much trauma in his heart. He hadn't dealt with issues of men or authority or working in a team or asking for help. And so then we took a deep dive into trauma, and eventually that rounded out what we now call the 5-point child development plan, where we want kids to be their needs holistically addressed, so that we eventually release kids into the world who are able to financially be independent, still interdependent within their communities, and fully dependent on Jesus. And that's now the goal of the kids that we work with at Back2Back.
Just maybe one final area to talk about as you've been talking. Sometimes we feel like there's so much problems in the world. We've touched on this, but whether it's orphans or whatever area we work in, it's a drop in the bucket. So why bother? Or there can be a sense of guilt. I didn't save that one, or I didn't, have that spiritual conversation with that family member. I tried, but things didn't go the way I would hope. Or it's easy to just get depressed and say, well, why bother? And I feel like, as the years go by, I guess I have this thought is I'm not responsible for solving every problem in the world. I'm just responsible for, Lord Jesus, what are the things that you want me to do? What are the areas? What are the ministries? What are the people? I'm just responsible for listening and doing that. And that might mean some might think I have a big ministry, a small ministry, which is irrelevant. The only person's opinion that matters is God's. And it's not easy, but I'm trying to have that attitude of not being measured by numbers. When my book came out in the fall of 2021, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trial to Lead a Life of Significance. I mean, I was pretty much on my knees saying, Lord, I will not be defined by numbers. If it sells 1, 1,000, 10,000, it's irrelevant. All I'm called to be is faithful. I will not measure my sense of self-worth by numbers, even numbers of a book or numbers on a podcast. Not that we don't try to improve those numbers. We try to do all the things you can. I'm not foolish, to use your words. I'm sensible. I'm a planner. I have a Harvard MBA. I do get this stuff. But my sense of self-worth and identity will not be measured by, numbers or the impact the world sees or, places I speak at or, what have you. So, and I'm not responsible for solving every problem in the world. I'm not responsible for solving any of them. I just need to be faithful to what God has led me to. And does any of that make any sense at all? Because I think, put that in your words, or what's your sort of thoughts about that paradigm, or how would you put it in Beth Guckenberger phraseology, if you will?
In my first language. 100%. I mean, when I think, again, just circling back to the beginning of our conversation, when I think about what being in the presence of someone dying did for me, it made me realize this life that I live, it's mine. I give it back to God, but no one else should tell me what to do with my life. No one else should, that doesn't mean I'm not influenced by the right things. But at the end of the day, you only get this day one time, and you exchange it for, what are we exchanging today for? What conversations, what things have I labored towards? What have I given myself to? My most important commodity. And, we've learned how to budget our money and we've learned how to budget our time, but the most important thing for me to budget, frankly, is my energy, my capacity. And so what am I going to budget my energy towards? Am I just going to give it away all day to anybody who asks it and we'll figure out if there's enough at the end of the day? Or am I going to think about, I want the bulk of my energy to go in this direction. And, I want the intentionality of a life that I've lived in a way that I've given it away. And I can just testify to your listeners that the more I have given my life away, the richer it's become.
That sound you just heard, listener, was the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating that we have begun our descent to end our conversation, but we are not there yet. A couple things before we get there. One, Beth, I just want to be in full openness and honesty say to you, I'm going to steal the look viewpoint of the way that you do things. I love that. So
of course,
I'll be using that in conversation with friends. Very, very, very sterling insight into how we should regard those with whom we interact. Second thing, I would be remiss if I did not give you the opportunity to let listeners know how they can find out more about you and Back2Back Ministries. So how can they find out more?
Absolutely. They can find us online at back2back.org. Certainly we're on all social media platforms, and you can find me every place. You can find me on social media platforms. I have my own website, but any of those locations, back2back.org is probably a great place to start.
Awesome. Warwick, you're the one who brought Beth into our midst. You can be the one who asks Beth the final question as we wrap.
Well, thank you, Beth. I mean, it was a privilege to hear you at that Taylor event back in February and read your book, Reckless Faith. And maybe I have more reckless faith than I think, but I just feel like that's so not me. But, maybe it could be with, God's intervention. So it's, given me a lot to think about. So almost hesitate to ask the last question because what you said before was just so fantastic. But the question we often ask is, there might be some listeners today listening to you, and today might be their worst day. As we often say, they might be in the bottom of the pit, and there's all sorts of pits. It could be, loss of a loved one, abuse, financial failure, physical loss. They might feel like there's no hope. Any faith they had was squelched. What would be a word of hope for those who maybe today is their worst day?
That they're not alone. I think one of the things that can happen to us on bad days is we can feel shame and we can feel isolated. And those are dangerous mindsets to adopt, that this happened to us because we're not okay. And in our very core, there's something about us broken and we're not okay. And there's that shame is very insidious. And isolation is where we don't get any fresh air into our thinking. And if our thinking is toxic because it's our worst day, it can just make us sicker. And so I would just say to someone who's in a really bad day, reach out and look up. And I'll pray that someone is there for you in that place.
I have been in the communication business long enough, listener, to know when the last words have been spoken on a topic, and Beth has just spoken it. Thank you for spending time with us, listener, in this episode of Beyond the Crucible. And please remember, before we meet again, in the time that it takes for us to meet again, which will be next week, please remember that we understand that your crucible experiences are indeed difficult. We've described some of the difficulties of those crucibles right here in this episode. But we also know, and we described that as well, we talked about that as well, that they're not the end of your story. In fact, if you learn the lessons of what is being taught to you in those moments, you can move on one step at a time, and the direction that it will lead you can become the most fulfilling direction that you go can become the most fulfilling destination that you end up at, because that destination is a life of significance.
If you enjoyed this episode, learned something from it, we invite you to engage more deeply with those of us at Beyond the Crucible. Visit our website, beyondthecrucible.com, to explore a plethora of offerings to help you transform what's been broken into breakthrough. A great place to start? Our free online assessment, which will help you pinpoint where you are on your journey beyond your crucible and to chart a course forward. See you next week.